Okay, so in this part of section 6.1, we're going to factor a polynomial, and notice this polynomial has 4 terms, and the variable is just x, so if you look at it, it's written in descending order. Now, in some examples, you will have more than one variable, but in this polynomial, the variable is just x, and it's written in descending order, 3, 2, 1, and then the constant term. So we're going to factor this polynomial by grouping, and let's kind of review some steps to factoring a polynomial by grouping. All right, so here are the steps. So step 1, you're going to group the terms into 2 groups of 2 terms so that each group has a common factor. Step 2, factor out the GCF from each group. And then step 3, if there is now a common binomial factor in the group, factor it out. Step 4, if not, rearrange the terms and then try these steps again. All right, so those are the steps for factoring a polynomial that has 4 terms. Okay, now, so if we use those steps in this example, normally what we're going to do is we're going to group the first 2, and then we're going to group the last 2 terms. So the first 2 and the last 2. And if you need to, it sometimes helps if you cover up the group that you're not looking at. All right, so in this group right here, we have x cubed and 4x squared. So the GCF of these 2 terms is x squared. So I'm going to factor out an x squared from the first group, so from these 2 terms. When I factor out the GCF from the first 2 terms, and we got to write as a product, so x squared times x, so think of the FOIL method to help you. X squared times x is x cubed plus x squared times 4 is 4x squared. All right, now let's look at the second group. The second group, 3x, the terms 3x and 12, the GCF here is 3. So I'm going to factor out a 3. GCF is 3, so I'm going to factor out a 3. And remember, you write as a product, so it'll be 3 times x is 3x plus 3 times 4 is 12. All right, so that was the step 1 and step 2. So step 1 and step 2. Now step 3, I'm going to put this back up here. Step 3 says if there is now a common binomial factor in a group, factor it out. So there is a common binomial factor. So there is a common factor in these 2 groups. So I'm going to take this x plus 4, I'm going to factor it out. So when I do that, I'm going to have x plus 4 times, now when I take out this x plus 4, when I factor out this x plus 4, if you need to cover it up, you're left with x squared. And when I factor out this x plus 4, you're left with 3. Now remember, when you factor, you want to write as a product, so times, multiplication, a product of factors. And you can always check yourself. X plus 4 times x squared gives us this. And then x plus 4, using the idea of the distributive method, x plus 4 times 3 gives us this. All right, so there's your answer. So remember, to factor, you have to write as a product of factors. So this is not your answer, because that's the sum of 2 factors, or 2 products, and each product made up of factors. All right, so that is not your answer. This is your answer. All right, so here's number 56. Let's look at this example. Let's see. Let's do 62. So it'll be 62. You have 8w squared plus 7wv plus 8w plus 7v. All right, so again, step 1, we're going to group the terms into 2 groups. So first group, second group. So again, first group, second group. Now this time I have two sets of variables, w and v. Okay, so in this first group, if you look at this, the GCF is w. So if you look at the coefficients, 8 and 7, the GCF is 1. This term has two factors of w. This one only has one, so we take out one factor. This has a v. This has no v as a factor, so we can't take out a v. We cannot factor out a v. So the GCF is just w. So I'm going to get w times, and then remember you got to write this as a product. So it's your GCF times polynomial that will give us this back. So w times 8w is 8w squared plus w times 7v is 7wv. So w times 7v gives us this. Now over here, if you look at this, the terms 8w and 7v, so the GCF, remember now, the GCF of 8w and 7v is 1. Alright, so don't say there's no GCF. There is a GCF, it's just 1. So I'm going to factor out a 1. So the 1, I'm going to say 1 times 8w plus 7v. So you may say, well, why'd you have to write this if it looks the same? Well, it helps. You didn't have to, but it helps because now you can see that one of your factors, when you write out your factors, one of them has to have the term plus 1 in it. Okay, so now from here, if you look at these two sets of factors here, this set of factors and then this set of factors. Now remember, this is not your answer because you got to write the whole thing as a product, okay? But they have an 8w plus 7v in common. So you take out 8w plus 7v, you factor it out, 8w plus 7v, and then if you factor out the 8w plus 7v, if you factor this out, you're left with w, so times w, and again, factor it out, you're left with plus 1. All right, and so there's your answer. So 8w plus 7v. So you wrote this polynomial as a product of factors using grouping. Okay? All right, let's look at number 64. So the 64, you have 6x minus 42 plus xy minus 7y. So 6x minus 42 plus xy minus 7y. Okay, so again, we're going to do the first step. We're going to group these two terms, and then we're going to group these two terms. So if I group these two terms, the GCF of these two terms is 6. So I'm going to factor out a 6, and you're left with x minus 7. And always check yourself. 6, use your distributive property. 6 times x is 6x. 6 times a negative 7 is a negative 42. All right, now from this group, it looks like the only thing I can factor out is the y. So I'm going to say plus y times, now I'm going to write it as a GCF times a polynomial that will give you these two terms back. So y times x, so y times x gives us xy, minus y times 7, so y times the negative 7 gives us a negative 7y. Now if you look at this, we're on the right track, because if you look at these two sets of factors here, they have an x minus 7 in common. So you're going to take the x minus 7 out. You're going to factor out the x minus 7. So GCF of these two terms here, these two terms, is x minus 7. So you factor out x minus 7 times, remember you got to write a product, and then you're left with 6 plus, and you're left with y. All right, you can always check yourself going backwards. X minus 7 times 6 is this, plus, and then x minus 7 times y is y times x minus 7. All right, so there's your answer. Okay, now let's look at 66. So let's look at 66. So in 66, you have 2x cubed minus x squared minus 10x plus 5. Okay, now let's discuss how this looks different than the others. Now the first two are fairly easy. First two are easy because if you look at all of your terms, they had positive coefficients. Over here, all of your terms had positive coefficients. Now here, two of your terms had negative coefficients, but it still wasn't that bad. It wasn't difficult. It's fairly easy to do. Now, if you look at this one, what's going to make this a little bit tricky, and you got to be careful, is this middle sign right here. So when we talk about it, just remember this sign right here. The sign of that third term. So remember, that's a negative 10x. All right, so the sum of that, the sign of that third term is a negative 10x. See here, the third term is positive, so that wasn't that difficult. All right, now let's go ahead and factor this. So we're going to group the first two and the last two, just like we've been doing. The first group is easy. If you look at this, they have an x squared in common, so that's my GCF. So the GCF is x squared, so I can factor out an x squared. Remember, you got to write as a product, so x squared times what is 2x cubed. So we just 2x. Always check yourself. X squared times 2x is 2x cubed. So remember last semester, when you multiply like bases, you add exponents. 2 plus 1. Remember, x to the first is x cubed. Minus, now you have to have something there. Don't put a 0. X squared, if you put a 0, that's not correct, because x squared times 0 is 0. You don't want a 0, you want an x squared. So x squared times a 1 is an x squared. So x squared times a negative 1 is a negative x squared. All right, now let's talk about this. Okay, so you see how that third term, the sign is negative? So what you want to do is you want to factor out a negative GCF from here. So you factor out a negative GCF. So the GCF of negative 10x and 5, if you're going to take out a negative, is a negative 5. So you're going to factor out a negative 5. All right, so factor out a negative 5. Make sure that sign, this sign, and this sign are the same. I mean, it's truly here. Look, this sign was positive. This sign was positive. This sign was positive. This sign was positive. The coefficient of 3x here was positive. You factor out a positive. Okay? So coefficient here of the third term is positive. You factor out a positive GCF. Coefficient of the third term here is a negative. You're going to factor out a negative GCF. Okay? All right, now be careful. Negative 5 times what is a negative 10x? So the answer is 2x. Don't say negative 2x. That's not true, because a negative times a negative would be a positive, and that's not what we want. We want a negative. So this is a positive 2x. A negative 5 times what is a positive 5? Well, remember, a negative times a negative is a positive. It just has to be negative. Now, negative 5 times a negative 1 is a positive 5. All right, now always check yourself, because if it's fractable, then these two terms, or these two factors rather, in these two terms should be the same. So now I can factor out a 2x minus 1, and I'm left with, so if I take out this 2x minus 1, I'm left with x squared. If I factor out this 2x minus 1, I'm left with a negative 5. And there's your answer. You wrote your answer as a product of factors. Okay, so let's look at one more. This is going to be number 72. I'll put 72 here. This is number 72. And so we have 6m squared minus 5mn minus 6m plus 5n. So 6m squared minus 5mn minus 6m plus 5n. All right. Okay, so notice the third term. Notice the third term is a negative coefficient. Okay, so from the first two, we're factoring these four terms by grouping. We're factoring these four terms by grouping. That's what we've been doing, factoring by grouping. So we're going to group the first two together. We're going to group the last two together. From the first group, it looks like the only thing I can take out, the only GCF, it looks like the GCF is m. So factor out an m. I'm left with 6m. Always check yourself. M times 6m is 6m squared minus, and if I factor out this m out of here, I'm left with 5n. Okay, always check yourself. M times a negative 5n is a negative 5mn. Now remember what we do here. So we got to factor out the negative GCF. So the GCF of a negative 6m and 5n, if I take out the negative GCF, would be a negative 1. All right, now be careful. Remember what we talked about. A negative 1 times a positive 6m is a negative 6m. Now always check yourself. See how this is 6m? You really want that term to be the same thing. A negative 1 times what is a positive 5n? So the answer is a negative 5n, because a negative times a negative is a positive. Always look at this. So this kind of helps you. All right. And then finally, so now these two terms, this term and this term, they have a common factor. So we're going to take it out. So we're going to factor it out. So you have 6m minus 5n times, and then remember, if you factor out a 6m minus 5n, you're left with m. And then again, if you factor out 6m minus 5n, you're left with negative 1. And there's your answer. Okay, so this part right here, this part dealt with factoring a polynomial that had four terms by grouping. All right.